Our next speaker, Bob Terrio, is a professional video producer and videographer, photographer, and illustrator who has had a lifelong interest, like a lot of us, in, among other things, UFOs and the life and work of Walt Disney. Born and raised in the suburbs of Boston in the 50s and 60s, Bob was a true Disney baby, loving the many Disney films and television programs, including the original Mickey Mouse Club, all of which stirred his imagination. His love of drawing led to dreams of becoming a Disney animator when he grew up. His interests in film and illustration led to his studying at the Rochester Institute of Technology, where he earned a Bachelor's of Fine Arts degree in film, photography, and art. While most of his income has been generated in the industrial and commercial markets, Bob has produced film and video documentaries about such varied subjects as the great American psychic Edgar Cayce, Jane Roberts and the Seth Material, ghosts and hauntings in the Philadelphia, PA region, and more has been involved in producing UFO-related programs and documentaries with individuals including Linda Moulton Howe, Stanton T. Friedman, Richard M. Dolan, Travis Walton, Kathleen Martin, Jennifer Stein, and myself, among others. He is co-producer and cameraman on Jennifer Stein's outstanding multi-award-winning documentary, Travis, the True Story of Travis Walton, which many of you are familiar with. During the course of the past 50 years, Bob's reading has included literally hundreds of books on UFOs and the paranormal, not to mention documentaries and films, ghosts, cryptozoology, psychic phenomena, life after death, and other weird stuff. Most recently, he has self-published a novel for young people entitled E.B., The Real Story, about an alien who comes to Earth and befriends a family, and in the course of it, changes the world as well. It's available on Amazon Books, and I'm delighted to say I have just gotten a copy. Bob currently lives and works in the suburbs of Philadelphia. He has 4 wonderful sons, 3 beloved daughters-in-law, and 4 grandchildren who keep him very busy on the weekends. His parents live in Wolfsboro, New Hampshire, and Bob and his family have vacationed at Lake Winnipesaukee for many years. He's a dear friend, an extraordinary person, a great scholar, a wonderful artist, and I'm delighted that he's able to be here today with us. The title of his talk is UFOs, Aliens, and Disney Alien Encounters from Tomorrowland. Please give a big welcome to Bob Terrio.
So as Peter said, I grew up outside of the Boston area in Westwood and Dedham for many years, and we discovered Lake Winnipesaukee in the early 1960s, so I've been vacationing on and off there in the Wolfboro area ever since. So we love New Hampshire. I feel like I'm always coming home when I come up. So today, Walt Disney, aliens and UFOs. I'm going to bet that if I said the word Walt Disney, you would come up with a very long list of things to associate with his name. Probably Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Cinderella, Snow White, Frozen, a whole long list of things. Probably the last thing or something you would never think to associate with Walt Disney are aliens and UFOs. But hopefully after my talk today, you'll think differently about that. Walter Elias Disney. Who doesn't know Walt Disney? He was born December 5th, 1901 in Chicago, Illinois. He was the 4th son of Elias Disney, and he has one younger sister. In his childhood, his dad kept changing jobs. Was not a great businessman, kept trying things, and about every 4 or 5 years would fail and he would move on to something else, which also caused them to move. They moved from Chicago to Missouri, then to Kansas, back to Chicago. So by the time he entered his mid to late teenage years, he was developing an interest in art and illustration. His parents paid for art classes as a boy, and by the time he was 18, he got a job as a commercial illustrator. That was in Chicago at the time. It was during this time he also met somebody who would become crucial to the development of his animation films, a man by the name of Ub Iwerks, who was also an illustrator, and that was in 1920. And at about that time, animated films were really not a real thing at that point. There were some experimentations going on, and it's known that Walt and Ub saw a couple of these and became very interested in that. Walt's older brother Roy had some health issues, and as fate would have it, ended up going to Los Angeles to be treated for that. Roy and Ub went and followed his brother Roy out to LA and found that there was a developing film industry out there. So they started basically an animation business, like they say, in a garage, he and Ub, and that's how it all got started. They started doing cartoon work for other companies. If you've ever heard of Oswald Rabbit, that was a very early animated cartoon series that became fairly successful. They started doing very well with it. It became so well that the company doing who owned the rights to it, when Walt and his partner Ub decided to ask for more money, they said, no, forget it. So Walt then, on a very long train ride from New York to California with his wife, decided that he was going to come up with his own character and own the rights to it. And the character he wanted to, that he came up with, was called Mortimer Mouse. His wife said, no, it can't be Mortimer, we got to call him Mickey. So that's how Mickey Mouse became developed. And of course the rest is history, and we'll briefly go into the little history of Disney and his empire. As you can see here, he died December 15th, 1966 in Burbank from lung cancer. Walt was a heavy smoker. This is one of the things they kept from the public, but behind the scenes he was a smoker. In fact, it became kind of a joke that his animators, they're all very talented, not always super busy, but they could tell when Walt was coming down the hall because he had a pretty heavy cough. So when they heard his cough, they would all get very busy and start working very hard. So it became kind of a joke that what became a health issue that killed him was kind of a humorous thing at the time. Walt turned an interest in drawing into a multinational leisure industry giant, which I don't have to tell you too much about because everybody knows. But anyway, 1920s. The Disney Brothers studio started out of a garage in California, became successful to the point where, again, the Mickey Mouse character that was about 1927, 1928, right at the advent of sound. The first sound film, The Jazz Singer, was released in 1927. Steamboat Willie was actually the second Mickey Mouse cartoon that was in development. And as soon as Walt saw The Jazz Singer and saw what sound could do to films, he immediately ordered an audio track made to go along with Steamboat Willie. And that was not only the first, it was the first sound cartoon at the time. And was a tremendous hit. It was a sensation. On the level of the way Star Wars was a sensation back in the 77, this was Steamboat Willie and Mickey Mouse, became overnight a huge success. In fact, Mickey Mouse became so popular over the next few years that people, if they saw on the marquee at the theater that there was going to be a Mickey Mouse cartoon ahead of the feature, they wouldn't care what the feature was. They'd go to see the Mickey Mouse cartoon. It became that popular. Some firsts. First synchronized sound. Walt developed the first Technicolor cartoon. It was called Flowers and Trees, which won an Academy Award. The first feature-length cartoon, 1937. Of course, that was Snow White. Everybody thought he was crazy. Nobody's going to sit through more than an hour's worth of cartoon. Cartoons back then were 8 to 10 minutes at the most. Walt had a vision, and of course that paid off. Snow White was a phenomenal success. It was one of the highest grossing films of 1938. The film The Wizard of Oz would not have happened if it were not for Snow White and the success of Snow White. MGM immediately said, we need to develop some kind of a musical based on a children's story. That's how The Wizard of Oz came about. In fact, the original concept for the Wicked Witch of the West looked just like the evil queen in Snow White. Exactly like the evil queen. But of course that changed with time. Walt Disney received the most Academy Awards by an individual. He won 22 Oscars with 59 nominations. So of course after Snow White, up until World War II, every feature that he produced, he tried to outdo himself. Pinocchio was the next after Snow White, which many consider probably one of the finest animated achievements for a number of reasons. But every film was a huge success until the war years. And for a variety of reasons, for many years after that, the studio struggled, and each film did not make a profit. Dumbo, Lady and the Tramp, and all those films, which we consider classics now, did not make money at the time. There were a couple of things that happened. There was a strike at the studio, which really took the wind out of Walt's sails. He was really proud of his operation, tried to hire the best animators, and treated them all very well. But they wanted to unionize, and he didn't feel that was necessary. And there was pretty much one of his employees who really pushed that, and the studio actually went on strike for several months, and Walt took that very personally, hurt him deeply, and after that he really never had the same attention to the animated films. He started looking more towards television at that point. He also was looking into live action films, which he started with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which all became hugely successful. But as we can tell, Walt had many, many interests in many different directions, and that's what helped build the empire. So let's see, 1950 was the first of the live action films. Actually, Treasure Island was the very first. It was shot in England and did very well. In 1950, the Mickey Mouse Club was started, and it was about this time Walt had 2 daughters, and on weekends he would take them to the little local amusement park. And as he described it to people, it was dirty. The people who ran them were kind of seedy kind of people. So he came up with a concept where he was going to take a couple of acres at his studio and build just a little private little park where the Disney employees could take their kids and have a few little rides and just a safe, clean place to take their kids. Well, of course, Walt being Walt, this idea kept expanding and expanding to the point where he says, well, we've got to buy some acreage, and that is how Disneyland came about. So he put pretty much most of his attention and time into that, and developed a TV show called Disneyland, which he thought would be a perfect way to help promote the park, be an entertaining TV show. And that was right about, I was born in '52, so that's just before my birth. But he became a huge TV presence with shows like Davy Crockett Zorro, and many series and successful shows thereafter. So like 1955, Disneyland opened. 1964, he was asked to do several exhibits at the New York World's Fair. There were 4 exhibits, all of which were later moved to the park, including It's a Small World. So those were initially designed for the 1964 World's Fair. 1965, because of the success of Disneyland, he thought, well, we should perhaps open another one on the East Coast. And so the plans were made at the time with Walt for Walt Disney World down in Orlando, and which opened after his death. He unfortunately died before they could move ahead too far with the plans. So 1971, Walt Disney World opened, and in the 1970s and beyond, the empire grew from there to the point where there are now worldwide parks in Europe, in Singapore, Hong Kong, resorts up and down everywhere. ABC TV, they now own George Lucas's operation, Lucasfilms, the Marvel Universe, Jim Henson Productions, cruise ships. The list goes on and on. It is just probably the greatest entertainment empire. Walt Disney. Those of us who were born in the 50s and early 60s, we call ourselves Disney babies because while people today, younger people, have obviously grown up with all of the Disney products and the parks and everything else, people like myself born in the 50s, we grew up with Walt himself. He made regular appearances on TV, on his programs, and occasionally in theaters where they would have a promotion for a film, he would make an appearance. But, so he came into our homes and we got to know Walt as a person on a regular basis. Now, he obviously had a very public image, which he was described as being bashful, a bashful tycoon, a grandfather type, gentle, squeaky clean, and a patriot. All of the images they portrayed. But privately, he smoked heavily, as I said. He drank pretty regularly. He had a very bad temper. They said he would blow up over the least little things. He was a workaholic. He had a bed set up in his office at the studio, and many nights he just worked so late he just ended up sleeping in his office. This, of course, created some problems with his marriage. He almost divorced twice, but somehow that did not happen. He was not a person to regularly compliment his workers, but he did respect them and supported them. He did love his wife and his children. And during the McCarthy communist hearings, he became a whistleblower, mainly because of the experience he had with the fellow who tried to unionize and cause a strike at the studio. That kind of precipitated that. And I have to say that in 1974, I had an opportunity to go to California, to the LA area, and I had it in my head to try to do a job interview with Disney, see if I could get a job with them as an animator. So I did have an interview, and the person who I interviewed with, this is a true story, his name was Donald Duckwall. If you look at the Winnie the Pooh cartoons, he's a production manager on those, Donald Duckwall. And over lunch, this was 74, so this is 6 years after Walt's death, or 8 years. And I just said, you obviously knew Walt. He said, yes. I said, it must have been quite a person to work for. And he paused, and tears welled up in his eyes. He became very emotional. He said, yeah, he was unbelievable. Just an amazing person. Walt had many, because of his perfectionism, and he would often have major health issues because of the stress. And what saved his life was the doctors ordered him to take a break for a month to 2 months and just take a cruise or a trip somewhere, which he did. And he would always his health would perk up and be revitalized. But those things were not widely publicized. So getting a little closer to what the topic is today. Disney and the Robertson Panel. The Robertson Panel in the 1950s was hastily convened, a board of scientists assembled by the CIA and the Office of Scientific Intelligence. And the purpose of this, they were devoted to debunking UFOs. Now, as part of this panel, the CIA-sponsored Robertson Panel recommended that the national security agencies immediately take steps to strip the UFOs of the special status they have been given and the aura of mystery they have unfortunately acquired. They consulted the Psychological Strategy Board, and they recommended that this education could be accomplished by mass media such as television, motion pictures, and popular articles. Cartoons by Walt Disney were recommended. It was the only studio mentioned by name that could help accomplish this. There's no actual records as to if the CIA had official contact with Disney, but from this Robertson Panel, because Disney's name was mentioned, a lot of people suspect that contact was made and some effort was made. But what we do have more information on, Disney's biographer Mark Elliott says that Disney was an FBI informant since perhaps as early as 1940. In 1954, there is an FBI memo which recommended Disney be a special agent in charge, or SAC status. Because of Mr. Disney's position as the foremost producer of cartoon films in the motion picture industry and his prominence and wide acquaintanceship in film production matters, it is believed that he can be of valuable assistance to this office, and therefore it is my recommendation that he be approved as an SAC contact. It's also known that at the time of Disney's death, J. Edgar Hoover attended Disney's funeral, and it was overheard him saying to Mrs. Disney at the time, he told her that Walt was on the special correspondence list on a first-name basis. So again, there's not a whole lot of hard evidence other than those two pieces of information. But because of that, a lot of people believe that Disney did have some associations with the FBI. Not so much CIA, perhaps, but definitely Herbert Hoover had. So now, in the mid-50s, as part of the Disney TV series, there was this fellow, Ward Kimball, who was one of the original animators, starting with Snow White and on. Ward had a special interest in space, not known whether he had an interest in UFOs, but of course in the early 50s, 52, 53, UFOs were very prominent in the news and in headlines. But what Disney did plan for their TV series, for March of 1953 on the Disneyland show, a Tomorrowland segment was pretty much a scientific documentary called Man in Space. And Ward Kimball was the in-house producer for that series and was the on-camera narrator. And I remember seeing that at the time. They collaborated with Werner von Braun and other scientists at the time. Because of the success of that, it was followed by a Man on the Moon and Mars and Beyond. So we have definite proof that Ward Kimball had an association with space and science programs. Ward Kimball, later in his life, at a 1979 MUFON conference, Ward Kimball claimed that the U.S. Air Force had approached Walt Disney himself in the mid-1950s, requesting his cooperation on a documentary that would help acclimate the public to UFO reality. In exchange for Disney's cooperation, the U.S. Air Force would supply them with real UFO footage for exclusive use in their documentary. Disney accepted the deal and began to work immediately on it. There is a picture I found of Ward and Walt working on what obviously is a UFO-type model, storyboards in the background. Kimball and the other animators worked on concept sketches of aliens and UFOs for the project. When the U.S. Air Force eventually withdrew its offer of the UFO footage, Kimball challenged the colonel, who was the Air Force liaison, who told him that there was indeed plenty of UFO footage, but that neither Kimball nor anyone else was going to get access to it. The project was abandoned and forgotten. How different these conferences and life would be these days if a Disney-approved documentary became highly publicized and shown to the public. It would have been a game changer. And it's a shame it never got made. So we'll move on quickly to some films that Disney did make that have space, UFO, or alien themes or topics associated with them. This was a 1962 film, Moon Pilot, which I saw when I was 10. A fantasy comedy-themed film, but within that, Tom Tryon plays an astronaut who was going to be on a secret mission to be the first man to fly around the moon. Within the storyline, this woman appears, a redheaded woman named Lyrae, who ends up being an alien, human-looking alien person who kind of secretly becomes involved with the project, ends up being with him, unbeknownst to the scientists and everybody, hides out in the capsule with him as he's on his trip to the moon. So obviously, even though it's humorous, here we've got an alien, human-looking alien involved with NASA and with space. It was also said that J. Edgar Hoover was very angry that the FBI agents they were portrayed as bumbling fools, which is not the first time that's happened in movies. 1975, Escape to Witch Mountain. Again, human blondes, aliens, are involved in the form of two children who had a spaceship that crashed to Earth. These kids had telepathic and telekinetic powers, which have been attributed to real aliens, according to contactees. And their spaceship, which crashed on Witch Mountain, is what they're trying to return to get back to their ship. Two sequels were released based on the success of it in 1978 and 1982. Again, just a personal quick story. When I was at the Disney studio trying to get a job with them, they gave me a tour of the studio. We went into one of the sound stages, and you're familiar with green screen and blue screen where they do for effects. Disney had a yellow screen, what they call sodium yellow screen instead of green. So I went into the sound stage, and there was this huge yellow screen and a full-size helicopter sitting there. So I knew they were doing, I didn't know what the movie was, but it obviously was Escape to Witch Mountain. And so they were ready to do this effects process shot, and about 15 feet from the helicopters, just sitting on the soundstage floor in a chair, was a man, an elderly man. And as I kind of walked closer, I recognized it as Ray Milland, who was one of the stars of the film. And he was a huge, famous actor back in the 40s and 50s. So as I kind of walked close, he looked up, and I kind of didn't say hi, but I kind of smiled and nodded my head. He looked like this was the worst day of his life. He had the most miserable look on his face. I was shocked. It was like, and he like glaring at me. So I said, thanks, and I walked away. So learned a lesson that maybe making movies isn't always so much fun. He looked miserable. 1986, a film called Flight of the Navigator. Again, somewhat of a fantasy film. The storyline is a 12-year-old boy discovers a UFO while walking in the woods. He goes on board the UFO and ends up traveling to its home planet. And then he returns 8 years later, but not having aged a day. The UFO features a talking computer that was voiced by Paul Rubens, who's better known as Pee Wee Herman. So it's a real mix of kind of UFO reality and fantasy. But they had a big effects budget for it. The effects are very well done. And it really treated the UFO topic itself quite seriously. Mission to Mars. This was directed by a very well-known director, Brian De Palma. It follows a team of astronauts sent to Mars to rescue the first manned mission to Mars that ended in disaster. They discover a giant sculpted face as well as pyramids on Mars, similar to the real face on Mars. The astronauts learn that the human race is descended from an ancient race of Martians who built these structures. A notice in the film's closing credits reads, "The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, their cooperation and assistance does not reflect an endorsement of the contents of the film or the treatment of the characters depicted therein." Kind of an unusual message. I just recently attended the MUFON Symposium, which was down near Philadelphia back in July. One of those speakers, John Brandenburg, claims, based on his work with defense projects and having many friends in government, claims that the US government has been seriously investigating Mars since the beginning of the space age, that the face on Mars, as much as they've tried to discount it, it's one of their top things that they focus on to try to study. Based on John's research and evidence, he believes that Mars once had significant amounts of water to the points of giant lakes and or oceans. And because of the face, pyramids, and other structures on Mars, he believes that there was once very high civilizations on Mars that built the face. And it was very interesting. There's a lot of evidence that there was some sort of giant nuclear explosion on Mars some ancient time, and he believes that this explosion wiped out the civilization and permanently changed the entire environment of Mars, believing at the time that it actually had an oxygen atmosphere and sustained life forms very similar to us. Very interesting. A remake of Escape to Witch Mountain called Race to Witch Mountain, which reimagined the Escape to Witch Mountain movie, starring Dwayne Johnson, who plays a friendly taxi driver who meets the two extraterrestrial kids and helps them retrieve their spaceship that crashed on Witch Mountain, which was a secret government installation. Andy Frickman, the director of the film, grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, excuse me, and is a UFO buff. One of the main characters is a scientist named Dr. Alex Friedman, who was inspired by Stanton Friedman. Within the film, if you've seen it, there was a Las Vegas UFO convention, and featured in the film, it's populated by actual UFO researchers like Whitley Strieber, Dr. Roger Lear, Bill Burns, and others. Which brings us to Alien Encounters: The Ride, which was described back in the mid-90s as a sensory thriller from Disney and George Lucas. Originally at Disney World, there was a ride called Trip to the Moon, which later became redesigned as a Trip to Mars. Basically a scientific kind of ride that was in a circular room and you pretended you were in a spaceship. So again, they took this same circular room and redesigned it into this alien encounter ride. So in this, the audience still surrounds what is now a matter transference device, which is a giant clear cylinder. And in the process of the ride, it mistakenly transports a monstrous bug-like alien to the central chamber. The beast escapes, the lights go out, and it terrorizes the audience until it's captured and destroyed. It was considered too terrifying for Magic Kingdom audiences and closed October 12, 2003, after 8 years. I was lucky enough to attend the ride twice. It was fantastic. It was great. And wish it hadn't closed. Then in 2003, it was redesigned and made more kid-friendly with a Lilo and Stitch theme. So if you've been there recently, it's now the Lilo and Stitch ride. So Disney did two things to promote the ride, as they will with a lot of attractions at their parks. In January of 1995, they hosted at Disney World a UFO conference. Excuse me, which if you talk to UFO experts, almost nobody has heard of this. And a TV documentary called An Alien Encounters from New Tomorrowland, which was broadcast February and March of 1995. First, the conference. Disney, it was a 2-week-long conference at Disney World. They flew in and housed 20 top speakers, including George Knapp, Bud Hopkins, Jesse Marcel Jr., Zechariah Sitchin, Kevin Randall, Don Schmidt, and others. It was not publicized at all. There were 10 to 12 attendees. 10 to 12 people attended this conference for 2 weeks. There were more speakers than there were attendees. It's reported that Bud Hopkins became so upset that midweek he just left. He didn't tell anybody he was leaving. He just left. He was so upset. And most people are surprised to hear that Disney did sponsor a conference. And which brings us to the documentary. Disney produced and sponsored a documentary, an hour long, that was intended to run on television to help promote this ride. Michael Eisner, who was head of the studio at the time, personally supervised and filmed an opening segment, which we'll see. We're going to run a little bit of this program. It only ran on 5 or 6 TV stations randomly. It was no official big promotion of this. I, in Philadelphia at the time, on a Saturday morning, just happened to have the TV on to the station it was running on, saw a very brief promo for it, immediately ran, popped a VHS tape and recorded the program. So what you'll see is from my recording of that program. It was a 40-minute long documentary hosted by Robert Urich, the late Robert Urich, written and directed by Andrew Thomas, who was producer of the TV series Cops, and was a special marketing director for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The amazing thing is, as you will see, is that it presents UFOs and ETs as fact, as real. This is Disney sponsored. and you'll see it, I'm sure you'll be as shocked as I am. And Michael Eisner, head of Disney, filmed the whole sequence, opening sequence, which you'll see. They didn't have to do that. They could have just buried the whole thing. So there's a lot of speculation as to, especially since they were approached back in the 50s to do this, were they part of a plan by the government to help disclose UFOs? Because if there's any studio that's perfect for that mission, it would be Disney and their connection to family films and the huge exposure they have worldwide. So again, there's speculation. Was this another attempt to try to make disclosure an open issue with the public? But of course, the fact that it was not heavily publicized, and it just randomly ran on a handful of stations. And like I said, I just happened to have the TV on when I saw the promo, and that's the only way I would have seen it. So the question is, was Disney actively working with the government to help or be a part of disinformation? Or was this, who knows? There's so many unanswered questions to this.
Activating now!
People of Earth, do not worry. As long as those beams are on, the alien cannot fly out. Listen to me, please. Don't scream. If you remain perfectly quiet, it probably won't eat you.
We've got power.
Good. How do we get it back to the tube?
Just leave it to me. It's back in the tube.
Boost the power. Hurry. Good. It's working. More power.
The creature is about to explode.
So that last little bit of footage was from the actual ride that I kind of illegally shot with my video camera during the ride. But as you can tell, a lot of screaming ensued because the lights go out, the creatures escaped, and they have sound of the creature running around behind you, and then they had little breathers on the back of the seat, breathing hot air onto the back of your neck, so lots of screaming. But how different would our world be if instead of being shown on a few handful of random stations without any publicity, if this program had run on a Sunday night with the amount of publicity that Disney normally promotes on their programming, how different would our world be in our perception of UFOs? I think it would be very different. So thank you all very much.